Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes. We probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings series. And today's topic comes to us from commenter Erwin Mark Mata, who requested a video about Amlaith and the breakup of Arnor. Thanks for the excellent suggestion, Erwin. This is a great topic, but also a challenging one. It's great because the events surrounding the death of Amlaith's father, King Earendur, and the subsequent breakup of Arnor have supreme significance in the history of Middle-earth, the ripples spreading all the way out to the War of the Ring, a couple thousand years later. But the topic is challenging because very little is written about this time period. Earendur dies in the year 861 of the Third Age. We'll talk about what's written, and then we'll talk about what's implied. Maybe do a little theory crafting. So, let's get started. First, just a quick primer on the origin of Arnor and Gondor. These realms were established by Elendil and his sons in the Second Age, following the downfall of Numenor. Here's a quote from the Silmarillion that picks up right as Numenor is sinking into the sea. "Manning their ships with all who remained faithful, they forsook the land of Numenor ere ruin came upon it. They were mighty men, and their ships were strong and tall, but the tempests overtook them, and they were borne aloft on hills of water even to the clouds, and they descended upon Middle-earth like birds of the storm. Elendil was cast up by the waves in the land of Lindon, and he was befriended by Gil-galad. Thence he passed up the river Lune, and beyond Ered Luin he established his realm, and his people dwelt many places in Eriador about the courses of the Lune and the Baranduin. But his chief city was at Anúminas. At Thornost upon the North Downs also the Númenóreans dwelt, and in Cardolan, and in the hills of Rhudaur. And towers they raised upon Emin-Berid and upon Aman-Sul, and there remain many barrows and ruined works in those places. But the towers of Emin-Berid still look towards the sea. Isildur and Anarion were borne away southwards, and at the last they brought their ships up the great river Anduin, and they established a realm in those lands that were after called Gondor, whereas the northern kingdom was named Arnor." So we see the kingdoms were established in part because Elendil's ship was separated from the ships of his sons during the deluge. Elendil ruled Arnor in the north from the city of Anúminas, and his sons, Isildur and Anarion, ruled Gondor in the south. But, and this will be important later, Elendil was the High King, de facto ruling all of Arnor and Gondor. It's just that his sons were governing the lands of Gondor from their respective cities. Minas Ithil in the region of Ithilien for Isildur, and Minas Anor and the region of Anorion for Anarion. The two of them made a capital for Gondor between their cities at Osgiliath. Each of those three cities, Osgiliath, Minas Ithil, and Minas Anor, each had a palantir, a seeing stone, to communicate. The Tower of Orthanc also had a stone. And as the quote mentions, up in the north, Elendil had 3 palantiri of his own. There was one in his capital of Anúminas. There was one that became known as the Elendil Stone in the Tower Hills near the Grey Havens. And there was one at the Watchtower of Aman-Sul, Weathertop. Now, in the War of the Last Alliance, at the end of the Second Age, Elendil and his younger son, Anarion, are both killed. And the new High King of Arnor and Gondor becomes Isildur. His kingship lasts for a couple of years until the aptly named Disaster of the Gladden Fields, in which Isildur and 3 of his sons are slain and the ring is lost. I have a video on that if you're interested. With the death of Isildur, there is no High King of Arnor and Gondor until Aragorn, 3,000 years later. Instead, rulership is split. Just before setting off on his ill-fated trip to Rivendell through the Gladden Fields, Isildur spent time in Gondor, and while there, he does something very important. He bestows power to his nephew, Anarion's son, Meneldil. This is from the Unfinished Tales. Meneldil was the nephew of Isildur, son of Isildur's younger brother Anarion, slain in the siege of Barad-dûr. Isildur had established Meneldil as king of Gondor. He was a man of courtesy, but far-seeing, and he did not reveal his thoughts. He was, in fact, well pleased by the departure of Isildur and his sons, and hoped that affairs in the north would keep them long occupied. That's a fun quote, filled with foreshadowing. Notably the line that Meneldil was well pleased to see Isildur and his sons ride away north. After Isildur is killed, his only surviving son, Valendil, age 13, is put in line for the throne of Arnor, and he becomes king of Arnor when he turns 21. Well, that's a lot of time for Meneldil to quietly rule in Gondor. So, when Valendil turns 21, as mentioned, he becomes king of Arnor. But Meneldil says, hey, your dad put me in charge of Gondor, so it's going to stay with me and my heirs. And Valendil accepted that arrangement. There was no warring over it, as far as I can tell, and both men enjoyed long reigns over their respective kingdoms. So that's how Arnor and Gondor developed separate royal lines. And Arnor enjoyed an unbroken succession of king for about 800 years, up until Amlaith's father, Earendur. Here's a quote from the appendices. After Elendil and Isildur, there were 8 high kings of Arnor. After Earendur, owing to dissensions among his sons, their realm was divided into 3, Arthedain, Rhudaur, and Cardolan. Arthedain was in the northwest and included the land between Brandywine and Lune, and also the land north of the Great Road as far as the Weather Hills. Rhudaur was in the northeast. Cardolan was in the south, its bounds being the Brandywine, the Grey Flood, and the Great Road. In Arthedain, the line of Isildur was maintained and endured, but the line soon perished in Cardolan and Rhudaur. There was often strife between the kingdoms, which hastened the waning of the Dunedain. The chief matter of debate was the possession of the Weather Hills and the land westward towards Bree. Both Rhudaur and Cardolan desired to possess Amansul, which stood on the borders of their realms. For the Tower of Amansul held the chief Palantir of the north, and the other 2 were both in the keeping of Arthedain. Okay, so we learn a couple of bits of important information here. First, we learn that after Earendur, Arnor is divided into 3 realms, each realm ruled by one of his sons. As we'll see in one of the next quotes, Earendur's eldest son, Amlaith, rules over the region known as Arthedain. The other 2 sons are never named. Second, we learn that the line of Isildur ends in the realms of the other 2 sons, Cardolan and Rhudaur, meaning they didn't have kids, or there was some succession-ending violence. It's only in Arthedain that the line of Isildur is continued all the way to Aragorn and his son. Third, we learn that there was often strife between the kingdoms, which hastened the waning of the Dunedain. So, these realms were fighting each other, which could lead to succession-ending violence. The Witch King could have something to do with it as well, though he doesn't show up in this region for another 500 years after Earendur's passing. The main source of conflict involves Weathertop, Amansul, and the Palantir housed there. Turns out the Weather Hills were bordered by each of the 3 kingdoms, making that disputed territory. Though I think a neutral observer would say Amansul was in Arthedain. And note that last line. For the Tower of Amansul held the chief Palantir of the north, and the other 2 were both in the keeping of Arthedain. In other words, all 3 of the Palantiri in the north are located in Amlaith's Arthedain. I think that's important, and I'll mention why in a second. Here's a quote from the Peoples of Middle-earth that gives some similar historical information, but adds some good details. 861. Death of Earendur, last and 10th king of Arnor. The North Kingdom becomes divided among Earendur's sons. The direct line of the eldest son, Amlaith of Fornost, rules the realm of Arthedain. Anúminas is deserted. The other realms were Cardolan, where later was Bree and the Barrow Downs, and Rootower, north of the river Baranduin. From this time, the official names of the kings at Fornost were no longer given in High Elven form, but in Noldorin. Amlaith and his descendants maintained friendship with the Eldar, especially with Círdan at the Havens. Circa 1000. About this time, the Istari, that is, the wise men or wizards, appeared in the westlands of Middle-earth. So this quote spells out Amlaith's role in all this. Interesting to note that Elendil's former capital of Annúminas gets deserted in favor of Fornost. It may be, at least in part, because Fornost is closer to the contested Weather Hills and could be used to better defend that region. We actually get some insight into the move from Annúminas to Fornost from Elrond during the Council of Elrond in the Fellowship of the Ring. In the north, after the war and the slaughter of the Gladden Fields, the men of Westerness were diminished, and their city of Annúminas fell into ruin. And the heirs of Valandil removed and dwelt in Fornost, on the high North Downs, and that now too is desolate. Men call it Dead Men's Dyke, and they fear to tread there. For the folk of Arnor dwindled, and their foes devoured them, and their lordship passed, leaving only green mounds and the grassy hills. I think the most important takeaway from that quote is that the population of Arnor took a massive hit during the War of the Last Alliance, and never fully recovered. There just weren't enough people to populate both Annúminas and Fornost, and so the better strategically placed Fornost became the new capital at the expense of Annúminas. And speaking of Elrond, we see from the previous quote that Amlaith and his descendants maintained a friendship with the elves, particularly their close neighbor Círdan in the Grey Havens. There's the line about the Istari arriving around the year 1000 of the Third Age. We know that Gandalf passed through the Grey Havens and was given Narya, the Ring of Fire, by Círdan. Amlaith died in 946, but his son, Beleg, went on to rule Arthedain until his death in 1029. We know that Gandalf traveled quite a bit in that region, and was on good terms with the Dunedain. I wouldn't be surprised if Amlaith's son Beleg, ancestor of Aragorn, was introduced to Gandalf at some point. One other notable event we can glean from the chronology of Arnor's kings in the peoples of Middle-earth concerns Eärendur's grandfather, Valandur. After Isildur is slain, all 8 of the successive kings of Arnor died of old age, except one, Valandur. Tolkien writes that he was slain at the age of 190. The other kings all lived past 200. We aren't told how he was slain, but Valandur's death suggests that even before Eärendur's sons broke up the kingdom, this wasn't an era of complete peace and tranquility in Arnor. There were still threats to the realm early in the Third Age. I think Tolkien took inspiration for Eärendur and his sons from real-world history. It plays out a lot like the events that led up to the Treaty of Verdun. I don't want to get into the weeds here, but very quickly, here are the circumstances around that treaty. We're talking about Charlemagne and his heirs. Charlemagne ruled the Frankish Empire, which was essentially most of Western Europe. When he died, his son, Louis I, became ruler. Louis pulled in a Elendil of sorts. He was the ultimate ruler of the Frankish Empire, but he gave each of his 3 sons a region to rule under him, much like Isildur and Anarion ruled Gondor on behalf of Elendil. Louis I died in the year 840 AD. At that point, Louis's oldest son, Lothair I, he would be the Amlaith in this scenario, through primogeniture declared himself the new ruler of the entirety of the Frankish Empire, not just the region he was currently governing. That didn't sit well with his younger brother and half-brother, and they declared civil war. They then defeated Lothair in battle, and within a few years, the Treaty of Verdun was signed, officially dividing the Frankish Empire into these 3 regions, each ruled by one of the brothers. And each had a Palantir. That's what I think is happening in Arnor, though unfortunately, there wasn't a treaty. Here's the theory crafting part. We're told that, quote, after Earendur, owing to dissensions among his sons, their realm was divided into 3. One possible reading of that passage would be that, upon Earendur's death, each brother selected a region and decided to rule it. I don't buy it for a few reasons. Much like Louis I and the Frankish Empire, and Elendil in the Second Age, I think Earendur gave each of his 3 sons a region to govern while he was alive. When Earendur died, Amlaith, his oldest son, was 135 years old. The other 2 sons were easily well into adulthood and could have managed leadership roles. We didn't have a little kid Valandil situation here. And I take a lot of import from the fact that Amlaith ends up in control of Arthedain, site of the old and new capital, and the realm holding all 3 of the Palantiri. If the brothers had simply spontaneously divided the kingdom, it's not a very equitable split. Both of the younger brothers obviously really wanted Amansul, for instance. But they're not even contesting the other 2 Palantiri. They're only contesting control of the one that rests near the border. I think these borders had already been drawn up, well before Earendur's death. Thus the reason that the eldest son received the most politically and strategically powerful region. The first quote I read from the time of Elendil's reign says, "At Fornost upon the North Downs also the Númenóreans dwelt, and in Cardolan, and in the hills of Rhudaur." That means those regions were already established and named 1,000 years before the brothers took them for their own. I think the younger brothers feared, perhaps rightly, that Amlaith, like Lothair I, would attempt to reclaim total rulership of Arnor, including the lands that they were currently governing. And their power, and their children's power, would be diminished. Just to give some context to this division within Arnor, we're going to jump forward about 500 years. The situation hasn't changed much in Arnor during that time, but change is coming. This is during the reign of one of Amlaith's descendants, Argelib I. In the quote I'm about to read from the appendices, we learn that there are no more legitimate heirs in Cardolan or Rhudaur. One of the previous quotes I read mentioned that the line eventually perished. Well, at this point, it's perished. Meaning, the only claim to the royal bloodline of Elendil now belongs with Argelib I in Arthedain. So he makes a play to reclaim the title of King of all Arnor. It doesn't go well. In the days of Argelib, since no descendants of Isildur remained in the other kingdoms, the kings of Arthedain again claimed the lordship of all Arnor. The claim was resisted by Rhudaur. There the Dunedain were few, and power had been seized by an evil lord of the Hillmen, who was in secret league with Angmar. Argelib therefore fortified the Weather Hills, but he was slain in battle with Rhudaur and Angmar. Arveleg, son of Argelib, with the help of Cardolan and Lindon, drove back his enemies from the hills, and for many years Arthedain and Cardolan held in force a frontier along the Weather Hills, the Great Road, and the Lower Horwell. It is said that at this time Rivendell was besieged. A great host came out of Angmar in 1409, and crossing the river entered Cardolan and surrounded Weathertop. The Dunedain were defeated, and Arveleg was slain. The Tower of Amansul was burned and razed, but the Palantir was saved and carried back in retreat to Fornost. Rhudaur was occupied by evil men subject to Angmar, and the Dunedain that remained there were slain or fled west. Cardolan was ravaged. Arafor, son of Arveleg, was not yet full grown, but he was valiant, and with aid from Círdan, he repelled the enemy from Fornost and the North Downs. A remnant of the faithful among the Dunedain of Cardolan also held out in Tirn Gorthad, the Barrow Downs, or took refuge in the forest behind. It is said that Angmar was for a time subdued by the elven folk coming from Lindon, and from Rivendell, for Elrond brought help over the mountains out of Lorien. So we see 2 successive rulers of Arthedain killed in battle. are Geleb and his son Arvelig. The connection to Elendil is definitely being threatened. Cardolan is now no longer an adversary, but an ally of Arthedain. They probably realized that Rudauer plus the Witch King of Angmar was a massive threat to their survival, so they joined with the enemy of their enemy. And we see that Arthedain's friendship with the elves, Círdan and Elrond, results in much needed aid in their fight. The quote mentions that Cardolan was ravaged, and a few of the Dunedain held out at the Barrow Downs. We get another revealing quote about those Dunedain from Cardolan in the appendices. It is said that the mounds of Tirn Gorthad, as the Barrow Downs were called of old, are very ancient, and that many were built in the days of the old world of the First Age by the forefathers of the Edain, before they crossed the Blue Mountains into Beleriand, of which Lindon is now all that remains. Those hills were therefore revered by the Dunedain after their return, and there many of their lords and kings were buried. Some say that the mound in which the ring-bearer was imprisoned had been the grave of the last prince of Cardolan, who fell in the War of 1409. The War of 1409 is the one mentioned in the previous quote, when the Witch King destroyed Cardolan, but was thwarted in his attempt to take Arthedain. Of course, the Barrow Downs are where Merry gets his dagger, which ultimately aids in destroying the seemingly invincible Witch King. So, though it took several years, Cardolan actually helped defeat their enemy in the end. The most notable information from that quote is that the mound where Frodo was imprisoned had been the grave of the last prince of Cardolan. We know this person was not of the line of Elendil, but from the phrasing, it suggests this was the final ruler of Cardolan. In one of the earlier quotes, we get the phrase, "There was often strife between the kingdoms." That quote suggests that Amlaith's brothers saw themselves as kings of their respective realms. Since Tolkien uses the word prince here and not king, I think he's implying that by this time, 1409, Cardolan wasn't just an ally of Arthedain. They recognized the king of Arthedain, Erefor, as their king. But by then, Rudauer had joined forces with Angmar, and the divisions started by the sons of Earendur couldn't be healed until the end of the Third Age. I think Tolkien is telling us that a united Arnor could have handled the threats it faced much more capably. But these three warring brothers sent Arnor down a path of its eventual demise. They broke all bonds of fellowship. So there you have it. The legacy of Amlaith and the breakup of Arnor. Thanks for the suggestion, Erwin. This was a fun topic. And thank you all for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye!